In this episode, we're going to look at various aspects of the framework for climate defense, including why defense is a concept that is both relevant at all and in fact very appropriate to consider in looking at the situation and policy to deal with it.
Now, let me mention why I have the word defense in this. A lot of people think of defending the environment, defending the climate. I am going to go so far as to bring up another startling concept, surprising concept, which is that World War III has already started. And it's not what we usually think of as, if we ever have a World War III, God forbid, what would it be like? Would it be atomic bombs, or would it be this lasers, or this or that, space war, cyber stuff? That could very well be World War IV if we don't win World War III. But I believe World War III has already started, and it's surprisingly going to be the worldwide struggle against climate change. I'm not happy to describe the coming of a war, but I believe the war has come, and basically we don't realize it yet. When we're getting 50 inches of rain here and 40 inches of rain there and 5 feet of snow, and pretty soon there have already been some killer heat waves. They will probably be getting worse. Hurricanes are getting worse. We're having landslides in Pittsburgh we never had before. Fires are worse. We've had a absolutely soggy summer. We may end up with mold diseases and things that we can't even imagine. Our food supply could sooner or later, a heat wave or a cold thing can wipe out this crop here or that crop there. Well, if that starts happening more and more frequently, if that becomes the norm, our food prices will probably start to go up, and that may eventually become a problem or a disaster. Water shortages are looming in some parts of the world already. Coastline trade can be screwed up if our coastal cities start flooding repeatedly from ocean rise. I mean, there are a lot of complications involved with a destabilized climate. And this is already having effects in killing some people. I mean, you get stuck in a flash flood, all of a sudden your life is in danger. You could have a son or a daughter going, out for a concert or something, and suddenly a storm comes in that's worse than they expected, and if you've had a few of these in a week or two, you can have a flash flood or something, and suddenly people you love, their lives are in danger. A fire could spring up, and somebody you care about very much could be affected by that. I bet a lot of you already have had acquaintances that have had a house or damaged, or people threatened, or having to shovel 3 feet of snow, and risking a heart attack, or any number of ways that these things can take a toll on us. diseases from the tropics are spreading north and things like that. So the Zika virus and so on, spreading to warmer climates. In terms of the struggle against climate change being World War III, the definition of a war, at least some dictionaries use one definition, that it's a great struggle. It's an extended struggle. It often involves mortalities and injuries and, tragedies on great scale. I would say that the Civil War in the U.S., more people died from disease than actual bullets. And it may very well be that climate change will eventually create disease on a scale as large as the Civil War. So the casualties could be comparable to the war, a World War scale. A war threatens your community with destruction, disruption of your usual economy. This could fit the bill of a war in that way. We talk about the war on cancer, the war on drugs. Well, World War I went in a very unexpected way. A lot of countries expected to fight that war on horseback, the whole war, with cavalry and cannons, just like in previous wars. Instead, they ended up having extensive trench warfare and gas, tanks, and airplanes, which had never, nobody even imagined that that would be the next big war. It was not commonly anticipated, even by military people, most military people. World War II, again, it did not go the way it was expected. People probably would have expected a repeat of World War I if there was to be another big war. And they thought World War I would be the end of all wars. It was called the World War. And World War II ended up being a very mobile war rather than a trench war. Aircraft carriers became very important. Submarines, warfare became extremely important. Things like radar became very important. Air power became extremely dominating, and you ended up with super weapons like the atomic bomb. All that was surprising and unanticipated about the nature of that World War. Well, I think that World War III is going to surprise us too. And the nature of it is that it'll be climate change that is threatening everybody in the world. And hopefully, the entire world will be allied in this struggle. And that gives hope that we can contend with such a formidable force that is going to be destructive if we don't do something about it. But the more we delay, the more likely it's going to become quite noticeable, and we're going to be in danger, frequently perhaps, or mortal danger, or succumbing to dangers. So, having people we love hurt and so forth, also. Inasmuch as I believe it is a war, it will turn into the scale of a world war in terms of destructiveness and casualties, I believe. I believe that it will be costly like a war if we tackle it with wisdom, in a timely fashion. I believe it would be quite affordable to stretch out the payments. And I believe that the way we financed past wars, which were great expenses, has lessons for us for financing this war. In this war against climate, I think it could be less of an inconvenience and maybe not even noticeable, and not having to be inconvenienced, not having to make great sacrifices, having things be maintained, and even improving lifestyles, and having a blossoming economy as we become cleaner. I think that I think it's going to be costly. It'll be trillions, but stretched out over decades and leveraged through creative means, and stretched, getting bang for the buck through a good creative framework. It can be well affordable. It will be no more disruptive to the economy than somebody, a middle-class person, getting a mortgage on a house. A house is much more than the typical person makes in a year, and I think the cost of this war is going to be more than our economy makes in a year. But when it's the payments are stretched out, then it becomes affordable, and it doesn't even have to be, rationing and long lines to get bread or something like that. Life can go on if we address it creatively, and we address it soon and efficiently. So I think it's also good to recognize that it will be a war. It is a war already, or it may soon become warlike to us if we don't realize it already. I think that one advantage of acknowledging that is that in a war, everybody is expected to pitch in, and there's no further debate about the necessity of being in step with the, get with the program, people. So I think that in a way it's advantageous to recognize it's a war. Also, I think that recognizing it is a war, an emerging war on a world war scale, I think that we should internationally try to tap into everybody's defense budgets around the world, and maybe just put a cap on them. Maybe just say, instead of having a few percent growth of those year by year, or 5% or whatever, let's take that growth and put it into defensive environmental funding. So the defense part of the double dip, triple dip defense The DEF and defense is for defensive environmental funding. It's going to cost us to transform the economy, and one way to fund it is with defensive funding from defense budgets. Defense budgets are huge, and they would be well spent in this cause to defend us from climate change. Now, I want to mention also that the federal government must be involved, I believe, in a big way. And why is that? There are a few good reasons why you want the government on your side in a war. You definitely, in the United States, we want our federal government on our side if there's a war. And first of all, what do you think is bigger, in economic impact, the United States government or Apple Corporation? And I looked into statistics on this, and I would say that government expense is a good way to measure, is one way to measure approximately the impact, economic impact of the government expenditure level. And one way to measure the impact of a corporation is how much they have in sales, because their sales are, representing the amount of goods that the amount of value that they're bringing to the economy in a way. And those measures favor the corporation, because being bigger, a bigger measure for them, because hopefully their expenditures are less than their sales, and that's how they profit. So looking at their expenditures and comparing them to government expenditures would be a smaller estimate of the corporate impact on the economy than looking at their sales, which should be bigger than their expenses if they're profiting, if they're an ongoing viable company. So say we compare the government expenditures to Apple's sales. Which is bigger? Which is having more economic impact, the U.S. government or Apple? The government's bigger than Apple. What about Exxon? Well, the government's got more economic impact than Exxon too. What about the Bank of America? What about Walmart? Think of the biggest companies and corporations you can think of. Well, actually, the federal government has more expenditure and economic impact than all those huge companies combined. You look at the biggest auto companies, the biggest American oil companies, the biggest, Apple, IBM, just all the big, Walmart, Costco, just the biggest banks, combine all those, and the government spends more money than something like the largest 30 corporations have in sales combined. So you want that big boy on the block on your side if you're trying to affect the economy. The government is also the only one of those organizations that can change the rules of the game. That's another reason you want the government on your side, federal government, in fighting a war and having to transform your economy. You want the government on your side also because the government is the only one of these organizations that will very inherently be able to benefit some from its investment in stopping climate change. You know, if climate change is prevented, Exxon is not necessarily going to see a huge influx of money into its profits because of that. Neither would Apple or Wells Fargo or Walmart necessarily have great gains due to the prevention of climate change. But the government would have huge expenditures on disasters if the disasters happen. So if you prevent the disasters, you save the government future expenses on disasters. If you don't have to fight fires, if you don't have to help impoverished people after a flash flood destroys their town and houses, if you don't have to help people after a hurricane, if you don't have to increase your military expenditures because another country's been devastated by drought and suddenly revolutionaries are springing up all over the place and terrorists, and so your military has to go fight a war to prevent terrorism or something, then you're saving a huge expense that's going to stem from future climate consequences. So the government has an ability to recoup some of its effort in this behalf, so of preventing climate change. So for various reasons, you want the government on your side to fight this war, the federal government, against climate change. Now, what is this framework that I want to promote and that I think can be a bipartisan, all-around satisfying solution and go even beyond environmentalists' fondest hopes for lowering emissions quickly, and go even further than the fossil fuel people's hopes in terms of preserving their wealth and livelihood and security of their lives and communities and their prospects for their families and friends and so on, co-workers. A plan that will keep that will help the American economy flower and blossom and have a energy renaissance. Rather than involving taxing, chipping away their business with higher carbon prices or taxes or whatever you want to call it, I have a framework in which we use tax forgiveness, positive tax forgiveness, to attract fossil fuel companies to take on their own transformation to clean energy or clean business. I came up with a name to help explain this framework and to describe various aspects of it.
It would aim to be politically viable by involving no taxes nor fees, and also by being largely voluntary. It compensates fossil fuels businesses, investors, and employees in a fair and financially neutral way. And it uses tax incentives via tax forgiveness in return for the early retiring of prioritized dirty assets, thereby lowering emissions, and the making of transformative investments into clean business, shifting those assets from dirty business into clean business. And the framework suggests various methods of voluntary financing and financing without raising taxes to make this all quite affordable.
I'm going to explain that title. The Double T.I.P stands for Tax Incentive Program. Okay, it's not a tax. We're not putting taxes on fossil fuels to lower their business. We're giving them tax incentives to do clean investing. Okay, it's a tax incentive program, TIP. It's also TIP in the sense that it is a transformative investment prioritization. What I would call transformative investment is disinvesting in fossil fuels and using that money instead in a clean investment. If you rely on the market just to expand clean energy. America is quite capable of using further energy, but that does not necessarily do anything about lowering emissions from dirty energy. You could double or triple clean energy and still be putting out just as much dirty energy year after year. So to me, a clean, transformative investment is an investment that takes money out of dirty energy and puts it into that same money into clean business, whether it's clean energy or business of another sort. So double tip tax incentive program, uh, the in order to stimulate that fossil fuel companies to want to make these transformative investments and shift their investments into clean business and clean energy, we would set up tax incentives to do so. The first sense of the dip, triple dip, is disinvestment progress. That you have to define progress by the disinvestment out of dirty investments. It's not enough to promote clean energy and just expect that that's going to somehow indirectly lower emissions. We don't have the time and the margin of error for that. We need to directly go after emissions and start lowering them directly and quickly and extensively. I think the way to do that that would be acceptable, hopefully, politically, uh, is that we will have a principle that this policy will not cause you financial losses. So if you're a fossil fuel community, we're not going to tax down your business and depress your business. We would be compensating you for your investment through forgiven taxes on shifting that into clean investments. So say you had $1 billion coal field and the government prioritizes that as being, a transformative investment they want to see done. They want to get that coal field offline and get you prospering and profiting instead on $1 billion of clean business or clean energy. And how would they do that? Is that they would compensate you by saying we will let you have tax-free profits on a clean investment of that size. If you will take this offline. So in other words, it's almost like the government would be buying that coal field from you with the condition that you not go and invest that money in another coal field or another oil well, but that you invested in clean energy or clean business of some sort. Um, Possibly the government could prioritize clean energy investments to some extent rather than just clean business. But and I think that the fossil fuel people should also be given the option of cashing out. If the government decides to prioritize some particularly dirty asset that they have, let the government pay the market value for that. But hopefully, uh, they don't want the cash so much as they want a profitable investment. That's why they made an investment that would be profitable, and uh, rather than having it sit in cash. And they have a stream of, they're hoping to have a stream of income from that investment through the years. So the government can set up a schedule, make them an offer, set up a schedule through the years that is just as good or better than what they would have made on the original coal investment. And so they won't lose. And this can be done in kind of a market setup where the government would prioritize dirty investments that they want to get offline, these dirty productions with particularly high emissions. But also they would prioritize in terms of not disrupting communities. If two communities pollute equally, but one is in a region that's totally dependent on that coal field for employment and its viability as a community, and another community is a coal field, but it's in an area that has other opportunities and other job sources, and that people can be retrained and not have to leave their communities and friends and neighbors and change their kids' schools and all this disruption, then the government could favor phasing out the operations that are less socially disruptive. And so say the government prioritizes some very dirty operations and then compensates the fossil fuel people in ways that their lifestyles and wealth do not suffer. That they keep the businesses going, but they help the businesses to transform into cleaner business over time. And so this becomes a mechanism to accelerate these transformative investments, to accelerate lowering the emissions. Within this framework, I'm talking about financial neutrality, equitable neutrality. Equitable neutrality for fossil fuels employees, owners, investors, that they won't it won't be a windfall for them. It won't be a government handout or a scheme for them to gain, but they won't be hurt. They won't lose. And I think that will take away a lot of their political incentive to oppose that kind of framework to lower emissions. If they don't lose, if their communities largely can be preserved, businesses can be encouraged to keep the same employees, but just shift them into other types of work. in the same communities as much as possible. Equitable neutrality, equitable financial neutrality, E.N., in defense. Double tip, triple dip defense. I think it's only realistic that a good energy policy, a good climate change policy that seeks to transform the whole economy from dirty to clean, it's going to cost money. It's going to cost society a lot of money. There is a need for cash, and that is exactly why I recommend these other two means of raising cash: the bonds and the percentage of defense budgets internationally, not unilaterally, internationally. Defensive environmental funding, let's get the US government to put part of its defense budget into fighting climate. The defense army and so on wisely consider climate change a threat. They see the benefit in if it can be prevented. Why not get Russia and China to agree to also cap their defensive expenditures at the same time? One doesn't have to put us at a disadvantage in terms of security to do this. Let's make an international effort where all the countries that agreed to the Paris Accords agreed to the need to fight climate change. Let's fight it with some defensive environmental funding.
The bonds and the percentage of defense budgets internationally, not unilaterally, internationally, so that nobody's at a security disadvantage.
I've suggested that defense budgets could be tapped as one way of funding the compensation for fossil fuels and fossil fuel communities, retraining programs, for buying out production of oil and coal and dirty businesses. Now, funding need not absolutely come out of defense budgets. I mean, that's a suggestion. That is a possibility, perhaps. If international agreements can't be reached whereby we don't feel it's a threat to our security, that, you know, we're unilaterally lowering our defense expenditures while maybe Russia and China are greatly expanding defense expenditures or something. If for any reason it's unacceptable to lower defense spending or growth of it, as I suggested, tapping the growth of it even, then funding need not come from defense budgets. But I would say that defense budgets are a good measure. For instance, in the United States, I think Donald Trump's first defense budget was something like $870 billion or something. Even a tenth of that yearly for 50 years, even a tenth of the defense budget, if it were used to fight a war against climate change, would probably be adequate to fund the whole effort, very possibly, or at least a great part of it, the lion's share of it. But if for any reason defense spending is something that the government decides and the people decide that they don't want any portion of defense spending spent on climate change defense against unstable weather that's going to be destructive to us, then hopefully funding can be found from other sources. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that climate change, if it does become a full-out crisis, as scientists are predicting, and extreme weather keeps escalating, then we will have more and more destruction. And it is a defense that we need to make against this happening. We need to take action to prevent the biggest tragedies from this: bigger hurricanes, bigger coastline problems, flooding problems, major rain, flash floods, fires, bigger snows, and probably killer heat waves will be the next thing that we're finding out about. So we do need a defense against this, whether it comes from the defense budget or not. And we do need to, I believe, treat it with the seriousness and the respect that we would give to a war situation.
fossil fuel communities will be compensated with funds that are raised both through fundraising, through defense budgets. Also, we could do like a war bond. When I said you can learn lessons from how wars were financed, World War I, for instance, was much greater expense than the whole the whole government budget, the entire federal budget, and they sold a tremendous amount of war bonds in those two world wars. War bonds raised a hell of a lot of money to help pay for those efforts, extraordinary efforts. If you have an extraordinary expenditure like a war, you can't expect the ordinary economy, the normal economy, to accommodate that. It's an extraordinary economic event, and it's got to be financed by extraordinary means.
So what if the climate scientists are right? And what if this is a looming crisis, is going to grow and grow, and we'll have even bigger disasters year by year? And maybe some years better than others, but generally a trend of pretty abnormal weather, extreme weather, and real challenges in terms of destructive weather on scales that we've never known. What do we do? If this ends up being World War III, or it is already and we don't recognize it, are we dragging our feet on this war? Is that what we're going to do? If this was a foreign power that had destroyed New Orleans, brought that kind of destruction to New Orleans that hurricane brought, if they hit our neighborhoods in Panama City like the recent flooding did, if they destroyed the Carolinas on the scale that the flooding did, and attacked New York City in the way there was flooding and damage there from a hurricane recently, if that had been a foreign power doing all that destruction, I think you could easily believe that we wouldn't be dragging our feet on responding. We would be defending ourselves actively at this point. We're a foreign power perpetrating this kind of destruction across our country. It may be objectionable to some people to take any portion of money from our defense expenditures to allocate to defense against climate change, but climate change is something we need to defend against. It is destructive. It is catastrophic. It's becoming catastrophic repeatedly, and it threatens to escalate in a major way. And the point is not whether the funding actually replaces other defense expenditures or not, or whether we can cut some of the slack out of the defense budgets and accommodate defense against climate change. But it doesn't matter where the funds come or whether the funding comes from voluntary bonds, climate bonds or environment bonds. But what is important is that climate change is taken in a realistic and serious way and a respectful way, such as you might regard a war, because it is destructive and catastrophic, and it's becoming more and more that way, and it threatens to very much escalate. So it's defense. I don't mind calling it, using the word defense is very appropriate, I think, and I do think it bears that, it deserves that respect and seriousness in how it's regarded. It could be that quite a bit of the compensatory funding of compensation for fossil fuels could be funded in a voluntary way rather than taxes. It raises the price on gasoline and raises the price on electricity and things. In regards to getting on the right side of history, so to speak, I'd suggest that the President and Congress create climate defense bonds and promote that it is environmental and patriotic, actually, for people to voluntarily invest in such long-term bonds. And that in this way, they can be themselves on the right side of history. And this would be for the sake of their retirements, their children, grandchildren, and future generations. Now, you want fossil fuels communities to transform to be on the right side of history, then let's all pitch in on the right side of history.